Let's take a look at fetching data from a GraphQL API. For a full tour of the API panel, check out the previous lesson, Getting Data from a REST API, because in this lesson, we're going to focus on the GraphQL specific features of the API panel, including the GraphQL Explorer. And if you want a quick primer on what GraphQL is, go back to lesson 1 in this module. Let's add a new GraphQL API. In the Nordcraft editor, find the data panel to the right. Then find the API section and click the plus button to open the API dialog. If you already have access to a GraphQL API, you can paste in the URL at the top of the API dialog. But if you're just getting to grips with APIs in Nordcraft, you can select the Demo GraphQL Countries API. When you add an API in Nordcraft, the editor will automatically call the API endpoint to fetch the data, which you can see in the API response panel below. This data is in JSON format, and the API panel organizes it neatly into collapsible sections or nodes. Here you'll see that inside the data node, we have another data node, a list of continents, each with a name, and a list of countries, each with a name. At the top of the response, you also have access to some helpful information returned from the API. In the response node, you'll see the HTTP response status code, which gives information about how the API call was processed. Now, in contrast to response codes returned from REST APIs, all GraphQL API calls will always return a status code of 200, which means OK, even when there are errors. When working with REST APIs, it's useful to handle errors based on the response code. However, when working with GraphQL, you'll find any errors returned from the API in the response body, which you can read and respond to accordingly. At the top of the API panel, there's a drop-down for the HTTP request method. When working with GraphQL APIs in Nordcraft, you'll only need to use the post method. This is because to request data from a GraphQL API, you need to send or post a query to the API describing the data you want to receive. To understand the different parts of the API panel, such as autofetch, parameters, and headers, check out the previous lesson on getting data from a REST API. Because now, in this lesson, we're going to dive deeper into what we're here for, the GraphQL Explorer. A unique feature of using GraphQL APIs is that you get a GraphQL Explorer in the API panel. It appears at the left whenever you're editing a GraphQL API and provides a way to construct your GraphQL query visually. When you add the Demo Countries API, it's set up to request a list of continents with the continent name and a list of countries with their name, which is what we explored in the API response panel a moment ago. When using a REST API, given it's resource-based, you would access continents and countries from different endpoints. In GraphQL, you can do it all in one API call. And you can also request extra information inside these fields. Another unique feature of GraphQL APIs is that they're self-documenting. This means they provide information about what data you can request from the API, which is populated in the GraphQL Explorer. This saves you from having to go back and forth between the editor and API documentation. Expand the countries drop-down to see a list of properties available for each country. You'll notice the data that is currently being requested from the API is highlighted in green. If it's a bottom-level property and therefore not an expandable property, it will also have a check mark next to it, shown here next to name. To add a new field into the request, such as the country emoji, click the plus button next to the field name. You can also expand the continents field and request the continent code. If the autofetch toggle at the top of the API panel is on, the editor will call the API and update the data in the response panel whenever you make any changes in the GraphQL Explorer. When you collapse any properties in the GraphQL Explorer, the selected properties will remain visible. For example, if I now collapse the country's property, the name and emoji field remain visible. Now, given this is a demo API, it comes with a query already built for you. When you add your own GraphQL API, the query will be empty and the Explorer will look like this. To add fields to your query, click on the plus button at the top right of the GraphQL Explorer to see the list of top-level fields you can request from the API. You can click on any of these fields to add them to the GraphQL Explorer, where you can further build and adjust your query. Now, currently, this GraphQL query requests all continents and all countries. But what if you only wanted to get countries inside Europe? For this, you can use a filter. Click the countries field to expand it, and you'll see a filter function. Expand this to see the fields available to filter on. In this case, we can filter by continent code. Expand the continent field and then the code field. Now, the continent code for Europe is EU. We can use the EQ or equals filter to request data for the continent where the code equals EU. Click on the cog next to equals and type EU in the value field. Press enter and you'll see the response in the API panel update, returning the countries inside Europe only. Now, what if we wanted to power this continent filter dynamically in response to user input? Let's take a look at an example and use some of the concepts we covered in the events and formulas modules. If you want to follow along, pause the video at intervals to set up the HTML attributes, formulas, and event shown on the screen. Here I have a select field which uses the repeat formula to build a list of available continents as option elements returned from the API. The display name for each option is the continent name and the value of each option is the continent code. Here I have a continent code variable. This variable value is updated using a change event on the select element each time a new option is selected. If I go into test mode and change the continent to Europe, you'll see the current value of the continent code variable update to EU. We can use this continent code variable to filter results on the API to show a list of countries inside that continent below the select dropdown. So here I've added an unordered list element with a list element inside it. The list element uses the repeat formula to show all country names returned by the API. Because we're currently filtering for all countries using the hard-coded value of EU, the list of countries will not yet update when changing the continent in the select dropdown, but it's only a few clicks away. Open the Countries API panel again and find the filter you just created in the GraphQL Explorer. Here we're going to create a GraphQL variable. GraphQL variables let you build queries based on dynamic values from your website's application state. In this case, we're going to build the query based on our continent code variable. Click on the cog next to equals where you previously added EU and select Create Variable. Here you'll see that the string EU has been prefixed with $, identifying it as a GraphQL variable. You'll also notice that you have a 1 next to the Variables tab. Click into the Variables tab. Now this variable needs a better name as it won't always be the value EU. Rename it in the name field to code. And below, we can use the formula editor to assign this GraphQL variable to the value of the continent code variable defined on the page. Click on the FX button and choose the variable continent code. If I go into test mode and change the continent now in the select dropdown, given the continent code variable has changed, the editor will call the countries API again with the new filter and display the new results. Now, this is only scratching the surface of what's possible. Why not try exploring what other data you can get from the Countries API and display it on the page using the formula editor? Or why not bring your own GraphQL API to build a query and display data on the page?